Pipeline Studio is about understanding your workflow and knowing when it's running smoothly.
Weave, holding it together. By the time a system is finished, three things are already in place. There was an intent, there is some level of alignment, and there is a perspective through which it's being seen. None of these are optional. They exist whether they're acknowledged or not. Intent answers why the system was created. Alignment determines whether its parts cooperate. Perspective shapes what the system appears to be. Most people encounter these in reverse. They see the system first. They feel how it behaves. They form an opinion. Only later, if at all, do they consider intent. Only when something resists do they notice alignment. Only when disagreement appears do they recognize perspective. This order matters. When intent isn't visible, alignment becomes mechanical. When alignment isn't examined, cooperation becomes conditional. When perspective is ignored, meaning hardens into assumption. The system still works, it still produces results. But the reasons behind those results become unclear. A system can appear aligned because effort is being applied unevenly. It can appear purposeful because output continues to flow. It can appear neutral because it accommodates multiple perspectives at once. None of those appearances guarantee coherence. Intent can drift without anyone noticing if alignment compensates. Alignment can weaken without obvious failure if people adjust. Perspective can fragment while the system continues to function. This is how systems persist, long after their original purpose has faded, not through stability, but through substitution. Something always fills the gap. Habit, process, expectation. Over time, those substitutions become normalized. People stop asking what the system is for. They focus on keeping it moving. When friction appears, it's treated as a problem to be managed, not a signal to be interpreted. When disagreement appears, it's framed as misunderstanding, not as a difference in perspective. When cooperation slows, pressure is applied. Alignment is assumed, intent is implied, perspective is dismissed. The system doesn't object. It absorbs all of this. That's what finished systems do. They allow intent to fade quietly. They allow alignment to be carried. They allow perspective to narrow. As long as results continue, nothing forces these elements back into view. That's why examining them together matters. Not to repair the system, not to optimize it, but to notice what's actually holding it together. Because once intent, alignment, and perspective are separated, the system doesn't collapse. It just stops being understood. And that's when cooperation becomes a choice rather than a property. What holds a system together isn't usually design, it's tolerance. People tolerate inefficiency. They tolerate ambiguity. They tolerate misalignment longer than they realize. Not because they agree with it, but because the system still produces something. That production becomes proof. Proof that questioning can wait. Proof that adjustment is unnecessary. Over time, tolerance replaces understanding. The system continues to function because people learn where not to push. They learn which questions slow things down. They learn what gets rewarded and what gets ignored. Eventually, the system feels stable, not because it's coherent, but because everyone has adapted to its limits. At that point, intent no longer guides behavior. Alignment is no longer checked. Perspective narrows to whatever keeps things moving. And normalization is powerful. It hides complexity. It hides cost. It hides choice. That's why finished systems are rarely examined. They don't ask to be understood.
They only ask to be used. And as long as they're being used, what's holding them together remains largely unseen.
Weave, narrowing the frame. As systems mature, the room for interpretation shrinks, not because questions disappear, but because answers become assumed. Intent becomes history. Alignment becomes maintenance. Perspective becomes habit. The system still runs. The outputs still arrive. The structure still holds. What changes is attention. Fewer people ask why the system exists. More people focus on keeping it operational. That shift is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It feels responsible. When intent is treated as settled, it stops guiding decisions. It becomes a reference point, not a constraint. When alignment is treated as sufficient, cooperation is expected, not verified. When perspective is treated as noise, differences are smoothed over, not examined. The system prefers this state. It's quieter, it's predictable, it's easier to manage. And in that quiet, certain questions become inconvenient. Questions about cost, questions about trade-offs, questions about who is adjusting for whom. Those questions don't break the system. They slow it down, so they're deferred, then avoided, then forgotten. The system doesn't demand that forgetting. It rewards it. Momentum replaces clarity. Continuity replaces evaluation. Stability replaces understanding. From the outside, this looks like success. From the inside, it feels like constraint. People learn where the edges are. They learn which parts move and which parts don't. They adapt. Adaptation becomes competence. Competence becomes expectation. Expectation becomes pressure. At that point, the system is no longer being examined, it's being preserved. Not because it's perfect, because it's familiar. That familiarity carries weight. It shapes decisions before they're made. It limits options before they're considered. The system hasn't failed, it has settled. And settled systems resist change, not aggressively, but passively. They absorb effort. They redirect attention. They normalize compromise. This is where preparation matters, not preparation to rebuild, not preparation to replace, preparation to notice. Because once a system feels inevitable, choice becomes invisible, and invisible choices are the hardest to recover. The next question isn't about efficiency. It isn't about optimization. It isn't about scale. It's about whether the system still allows examination at all, whether it can be paused, whether it can be questioned, whether it can be seen clearly without being defended. That's where the frame narrows, not to an answer, but to a threshold, a point where continuation and reconsideration are no longer the same thing. And that's where the next arc begins. When systems reach this stage, movement feels safer than reflection. Pausing looks risky. Questioning feels inefficient. Continuation becomes the default. People don't defend the system outright. They defend the need to keep going. The system benefits from that closure. It no longer has to explain itself. It only has to persist. At this point, change doesn't meet resistance. It meets exhaustion. The effort required to rethink the system feels larger than the effort required to live inside it. That imbalance is important because it means the system is no longer choosing itself. It's being chosen by default. And defaults are powerful. They remove responsibility without removing consequence. This is where awareness narrows further, not towards solutions, but toward recognition. Recognition that what feels inevitable was once optional, that what feels fixed was once decided, and that decisions once made invisible still shape everything that follows. That realization doesn't demand action.
It doesn't prescribe a response. It simply marks the boundary between participation and examination. And that boundary is where the next arc begins. This concludes this session. Let what you've heard settle before continuing.